The connection between the martial arts and culture is generally assumed by the cultural zeitgeist to be more of an Asian thing. However, the same also does apply as well to European cultures, and in this specific video, I'm referring to Nordic culture, or what is often most incorrectly referred to as Viking culture. That is, Viking was actually a phrase that they used for what they did rather than who they were. And it just eventually was adopted as a title overall over time. Typically, they were called Northmen, Danes, or just Norse at the time. That being said, though, their Viking culture, violent as it was, did develop a martial art that is known as Glima, and I first heard of it referred to as such after watching the TV series Vikings. In fact, it can be argued that the show is very much responsible for reigniting a renewed interest in Northern European martial culture that, before the show came out, honestly wasn't as well known before. In fact, I'm going to go further by saying that generally we didn't assume any kind of system or technique or style, as it were, to what the Norse did, that they're just basically shield and axe wielding psychos that went around assaulting and killing people. Now, I'm going to be straight with you here right from the bat. A lot of the scenes from the show aren't really developed from specific martial techniques as the Norse developed them, for the most part at least, because the Norse didn't really give any kind of step-by-step written manual, as it were, to how they fought, at least not in the kind of context that we see in later centuries. Nor did they have a living tradition, as it were, that passed down techniques from master to student, as you would see in Asian countries either. But that being said, examples do exist in terms of the actions and some of the techniques of what they did do in the context of stories that were written about specific battles or fights that they had, or in tapestries that were created in many countries after they conquered them, such as the Battle of Hastings, which often depict the Normans using shield walls. And the Normans were Norse who basically invaded northern France and settled there, and then from there on eventually invaded England. Now, I've spoken with some HEMA teachers about this, and many of them, while being respectful, don't truly regard Glima as a true HEMA martial style because of the great time discrepancies that involved. The sagas, which contain these stories that have the fighting techniques in them as part of their stories, being written centuries after the fact, if they were even true at all. And HEMA likes to largely revolve around notable teachers that you can track down and being able to basically pull a Jurassic Park with surviving or replicated written sources, as it were. In other words, trying to rebuild the martial style from the DNA that was left behind. And in order to do a replication of them, you need reliable and sound sources in order to do that. At the same token, I have also spoken with other HEMA practitioners who do regard it as a legitimate HEMA martial art. When Vikings came along, it was at the point where styles like karate, kung fu, and wrestling were widely being regarded as being somewhat basic and arguably traditional. Everyone knew about it, probably had done it at some point as a kid, and it wasn't completely foreign to them. It might as well have been part of the adopted Western culture in terms of its knowledge. It wasn't a question of effectiveness really, but perception. And as such, around that time, about 30 years ago, others started stepping up to the stage. MMA, Sila, Muay Thai, Jiu-Jitsu, and so on. Most of these through popular movies and sporting events that became more legal. And from what I've seen, Glima itself evolves around a type of wrestling/grappling style. And I've seen videos of some applying these techniques to weapons as well, since obviously Norse did use weapons. But largely Glima seems to revolve around applying the natural size and great strength of the people and their aggressiveness into a type of fighting procedure in terms of how they fought. The reason I think Glima and other related northern martial styles took off the way that they did lately is the same as anywhere else in the world, like in Indonesia, Thailand, and other countries. It's a native expression of that particular culture. It's not just a technique or style of fighting, but a fingerprint of the people's identity as a culture. You don't have to look to kung fu or karate or any of the more well-known, quote-unquote, traditional martial arts to build off of to create their own thing. They already have it. It's what came naturally to them in the lands that they were from and how it changed and evolved over time as they encountered other peoples and warriors in other lands and places. Sources and accuracy oftentimes matter very little to these people, it seems like to me at least, though Glima does claim to have a sound lineage as well. The show, Vikings, is very much historically inaccurate, both in timeline and in battles. While they showed the famous use of shield walls and raiding coastal villages, which is accurate, none of them pretty much wear helmets. And there's always the question of whether Norse women actually went out Viking, which is still a sore spot for many people, and I'm not even going to touch that right now. However, that being said, the show creators were always upfront about their purpose, and that Vikings was not out to educate people about the culture, but just to entertain people, for God's sake. Even its main protagonist for a while, Ragnar Lothbrok, is largely considered more of a legend than an actual historical person by many scholars, comparable to King Arthur in many ways. No one's quite sure if he actually existed or not. Yet, despite that, its mix of some presumably historical techniques and entertainment was still enough to inspire more exploration into Glima and its related northern styles. I even fought a woman at one HEMA tournament sporting the Lagertha hairstyle from the show, and was a big fan of it. So I think that if a martial style wants to plant itself in the cultural zeitgeist and grow from there into something more mainstream, then I think following what Vikings did is a good way to do that. Relax about it, the sources and everything, become popular, and inspire people to look more into it, and then give them the details about sources and details and timelines and all this and that. And otherwise, I think that is the contribution that Vikings, the TV show, made to martial arts overall and European martial arts in particular.